fast adrift in the howling winds of Tropical Storm Mary, just 800 yards off Smash Rocks at the mouth of Apra Harbor, Guam. Buffeted by winds of up to 50 miles per hour, the Caribia drifted broadside toward the narrow entrance to the harbor, then smashed on the rocks at the tip of the Admiral Glass breakwater. 20 to 30-foot high waves have been pounding the ship for hours. How much longer she can last is anybody's guess.
She was christened Caronia by Princess Elizabeth back in 1947. And sailed as a luxury liner in the Cunard fleet 2 years later. Unique down to the color of her hull, the 34,000-ton Green Goddess was 715 feet long, 91 feet wide. Her crew of some 600 served nearly 900 passengers in the luxurious accommodations of her 10 decks. She carried the famous and the wealthy to the pleasure ports of the world. To sail her became a mark of social distinction. Then came the jet age. Caronia could no longer turn a profit. In 1968, she was sold. Her name was changed to Caribia. Her distinctive green hull was painted white. She underwent an extensive refit to make her still more luxurious for even fewer passengers. But she had serious problems on every cruise she made. From 1969 to 1974, she was moored at berth 56 in New York Harbor. Then she was again sold. Dragged from her berth, she was towed toward Taiwan to keep a date with the wrecker's torch. In the Pacific, her tug, Hamburg, developed problems with the turbine on one engine. She lost power, but pushed on toward Guam, where she could get repairs. From the west, Tropical Storm Mary was also heading for Guam. Ship and storm met with disastrous results. Ironically, the master of Hamburg had set a course for Guam to avoid bad weather to the north. Hamburg's radio reported that with the crippled engine, she was no match for Mary. Wind and wave pushed the Caribia toward shore, dragging the tug and its crew behind. At the last desperate moment, Hamburg's captain ordered the tow line cut to save his ship and her crew. The rest is history. After hours of being pounded against the rocks by high winds and 20 to 30-foot waves, a gaping hole appeared in Caribia's bow. She held on until after 2 o'clock the next afternoon. On August 13th, she broke at the bow and slid beneath the sea. The question in the mind of all Guam became, where is she? Mary lingered on. The harbor was ordered closed. Guam is of strategic importance to the United States. Apra Harbor is a key supply port for the U.S. 7th Fleet. Home port for the Polaris submarines in the Pacific. And port of entry for materiel to support the strategic bombers at Andersen Air Force Base. And Guam's lively boating and tourist trade would not long continue without the recreational facilities of this beautiful warm water harbor. But now the wreck of Caribia lay somewhere at the mouth of the harbor, a hazard to any ship attempting to enter or leave. Even before the storm cleared, the Army Corps of Engineers Pacific Ocean Division was notified. A representative was rushed from Honolulu to coordinate matters of interest to the Corps. Coast Guard and Navy boats began crisscrossing the harbor mouth with fathometers and grapples. They determined that the south side of the channel was clear for ships and submarines if the wreck did not shift. The Army Corps of Engineers provided immediate funds to enable the Navy to fly in side-scanning sonar. The wreck was found. Divers were sent down to check it out. She lay off the end of the breakwater with her stern 150 feet north of the center of the channel. She was at a 45-degree list to port on a heading of 348 degrees. Her stern rested in 150 feet of water, and her forward section reached to within 20 feet of the surface. A 60 to 70-foot section encompassing the bridge lay scattered nearby, and an 80-foot section of her bow remained on the rocks. The Army Corps of Engineers sent a message to the owners of Caribia, the Taikien Industries of Taiwan, advising them of their legal responsibilities to mock the wreck and clear the harbor. When no action was taken immediately, the Corps asked the Coast Guard to mock the wreck with a buoy. Meanwhile, Caribia posed a threat to shipping in the harbor. Until the wreck was removed, only the southern half of the harbor entrance would be open to shipping during daylight hours. It would be closed to all shipping after dark until March 1976. Taikien Industries had been given 30 days to submit a plan for clearing the wreck from the harbor. They countered by charging the owners of Hamburg, Fairplay Peterson and Alpers Sea Towage of West Germany with negligent towing, a charge later referred to the High Court of London. The United States also filed a claim against the owners of Hamburg, then seized the tug and held it as security against the cost of clearing the wreck from the harbor. The towboat was released only after its owners posted a $3,287,000 bond. When the owners of both Hamburg and Caribia advised that they had no intention of removing the wreck, the way was clear for the Army Corps of Engineers to get the job done. A team of Army divers from Fort Eustis, Virginia, flew to Guam in November 1974 to survey the condition of the wreck and determine its exact position and depth. It was during these dives that a startling discovery was made. Caribia had come to rest not more than 20 yards from a sunken LCU containing nearly 60 tons of live ammunition. Since the explosives would present a hazard to divers working nearby, they had to be removed before the salvage contract could be awarded. The Corps of Engineers requested help from the Navy's Explosive Ordnance Demolition Team. The last of the explosives were removed in April of 1975. Then the divers visually inspected the area for 300 yards around Caribia and declared it free and clear of ordnance. But the divers could not see what lay between Caribia's hull plate and the seabed. On December 27, 1974, after 4 months of intensive research and planning, a request for proposal was ready to be sent to salvage companies around the world. Among other things, the document contained blueprints of Caribia in her last known configuration, supplemented by photographs and data obtained from reconnaissance dives. Climatology and oceanographic data were provided to give information on wind, weather, and waves. Working with the Environmental Protection Agency, the Corps obtained approval for a deep ocean disposal site 3/4 of a mile from the wreck in 2,000 feet of water, where the salvaged remains of Caribia could be dumped if the contractor so desired. And there was a carefully compiled report on possible sources of pollution near Caribia, plus a requirement for the contractors to submit a detailed plan for environmental protection. The request for proposal stipulated that the bid must be for a fixed price and that it must include a technical proposal for the removal and disposal of the sunken ship. Proposals were sent to 31 salvage companies worldwide. Only 6 offers were received. Of these, there was only one qualified fixed-price proposer who submitted a feasible plan for the operation and was considered responsive and responsible. On April 1st, 1975, in the Corps' Honolulu office, Colonel F.M. Pender executed a contract for the salvage of the motor vessel Caribia with Mr. Fujio Ichikawa and Mr. Suao Issei, representing the Nippon Salvage Company of Tokyo, Japan, the successful proposer. The fixed price contract was for $6.6 million. The work was to be completed in 450 calendar days. The Nippon Salvage Company has a long and distinguished record of salvage operations dating back to 1934. But it had never before undertaken a job which would entail so much underwater time at such great depths. The Nippon Salvage Company plan was straightforward.
The 500-ton capacity floating crane Hakuho, the tug Futamimaru, 2 barges outfitted as diving platforms, a debris collection barge, and numerous small boats will be mobilized in Japan and towed to the work site by the ocean-going tug Hayashiomaru. Divers working with OXR cutting torches and dynamite will cut the ship into 26 400-ton blocks underwater. Each block will then be hoisted by the floating crane and moved to a cutting yard to be dismantled and cut into scrap for shipment.
Other proposals ranged from refloating the ship with foam and towing it to the deep ocean dumping site to cutting and refloating the vessel in sections. As a part of this pre-contract research, the Army Corps of Engineers had determined from the U.S. Bureau of Customs that foreign salvage contractors and vessels could be employed in the recovery operation if it was to the advantage of the government. But the contractor encountered an unanticipated delay during the 30 days allowed for mobilization. It was not anticipated that workers would need labor certificates from the Government of Guam Department of Labor before visas could be issued by the U.S. Immigration and Naturalization Service. And before the labor certificates could be issued, the contractor was required to make a reasonable effort to find qualified workers from the local labor force. Newspaper ads were run for 10 days to determine the availability of qualified workers in Guam. When none were found, labor certificates and visas were issued. The contract was extended to cover this unexpected 30-day delay. Salvage operations got underway in July 1975. hard hat divers with traditional diving suits, less encumbered hookah divers with their surface-supplied air, and scuba divers. As one team of divers began cutting with oxy-arc torches on the ship's starboard side forward, another group was preparing to blast with dynamite at the stern. The salvage plan called for an entry hole to be cut in the hull over each deck at the forward edge of the piece. This provided easy access to the inside work areas, plus a convenient escape route in case of an emergency. Once inside the hull, the beams, bulkheads, decks, and piping were cut. As a safety measure, the outside hull was cut last. Since Caribia lay on its port side, the first cuts were made on the starboard side, forward. The contractor planned to remove the upper portion of the starboard side, take out the heavy machinery inside the ship, then cut and remove the lower starboard sections. In all, the starboard side was to be cut into 8 pieces, weighing approximately 400 tons each. To effect a lift, a sling was passed through rigging holes cut in the hull, then around the hook on the floating crane. Before leaving Japan, the floating crane had been tested and certified safe for lifting pieces weighing up to 450 tons. A certificate of safety inspection had been issued by Japan's Ministry of Labor. During the mobilization period, the crane was retested at the direction of the Army Corps of Engineers. With a sling anchored to Caribea's propeller shaft, stress was applied until onboard measuring devices recorded the equivalent of 600 tons. This provided a substantial margin of safety when lifting the large pieces. Measurements were also made on the crane's freeboard while under the test load to provide a quick reference to the weight of a piece being lifted. If the freeboard at the bow dropped below 22 inches, the crew knew that either the piece was too heavy or that it was still attached to the wreck. In either event, the load was released. The first piece of steel, weighing approximately 80 tons, broke the surface on July 21st, 1975, just 3 weeks after the start of underwater operations. It was not until August 28th, however, that the first 400-ton section was raised. At its maximum height, the block on the floating crane cleared the water by approximately 108 feet. Since the block itself was never allowed to enter the water, only small pieces of the ship, or those from shallow depths, could be hoisted high enough for towing directly to the cutting area. Most of the pieces were moved first to the breakwater. There, in shallow water, they were temporarily stored or de-rigged, and the sling shortened. With a short sling, the crane was able to lift even the tallest piece high enough to clear the dock at the cutting yard. The cutting yard was located on a leased dock in Guam's commercial port, approximately 3 miles across Apra Harbor from the wreck. Anchored off the end of the cutting dock, the floating crane winched itself slowly into position to deposit the massive block of steel in the scrapyard. While the ship was generally cut into blocks weighing approximately 400 tons, they varied widely in size and shape. At times, they cleared the dock with only inches to spare. The Nippon Salvage Company contracted with the local Ambith Corporation to operate the scrapyard on a dock leased from the Dillingham Corporation. At best, the scrapping operation was slow and the work difficult. The size and the weight of the sections, the massive rigging necessary to lift each piece from the water and move it to the cutting dock, the time-consuming process of reducing the huge blocks to manageable scrap. Each of the huge blocks presented its own problems. Each had to be studied and analyzed before it was cut. Was the piece structurally sound? Was it damaged? How could it be cut so the smaller yard crane could dismember it? How could the problems of debris between decks be minimized? On several occasions, oil adhering to the inside of the hull caused fire and smoke so thick that cutters were forced to wear face masks and head coverings. This proved to be one of the more difficult problems encountered in the scrapyard. Some of the scrap was sold locally. Most of it was loaded into containers to be shipped to Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Japan. Larger break bulk scrap was moved by truck to the commercial port, where it was loaded directly into the holds of waiting ships. While Japanese safety standards differ from those of American industry, the Nippon Salvage Company was required to comply with the rules set forth by the Army Corps of Engineers. Prior to the beginning of work, the contractor was required to submit a detailed accident prevention plan based on the Corps of Engineers General Safety Requirements Manual, EM 385-1-1. In addition, the contractor was required to conduct a thorough safety hazard analysis of the entire operation to anticipate potentially dangerous situations and prepare detailed emergency procedures to deal with them if they occurred. Where is the nearest hospital? How do you get the victim there? What doctor is to treat the victim? How can he be reached? The Corps' Guam Project Office made daily checks to assure compliance with safety regulations and to point out obviously unsafe practices and operations, such as this. The Corps required that the contractor build a cage to be used when it was necessary to lift workers to elevated work areas. As a result of the advanced planning and the daily follow-up on safety, accidents were held to a minimum. There were no deaths and no permanent disabilities among the 100 men engaged in this inherently hazardous operation. The Corps' representative also worked closely with the Coast Guard and the Guam Environmental Protection Agency to prevent pollution. Before work began on the salvage of Caribia, the contractor was required to consider how all aspects of the job might impact upon the environment and submit an environmental protection plan. The major environmental concern was waste fuel oil. While preparing the specifications for its bid package, the Corps had determined that as much as 50 tons of slop oil, 350 barrels, could have been left in the ship's fuel tanks when they were drained in New York. Some of the tanks had ruptured when the ship sank. Others lost their oil through filler pipes and vent tubes when the ship came to rest on the sea floor. There was every reason to believe that large quantities of oil remained trapped inside the hull, in piping and in the tanks themselves. To guard against pollution, divers were instructed to cut small test holes at appropriate points in the hull to determine if the amount of oil was great enough to require that it be pumped to a collection barge on the surface. Interior compartments were visually inspected also. In most cases, the amount of oil was so small that it was simply allowed to float to the... But the contract